Welcome to another episode of Leadership Lessons. My guest today is Jared Morgan, and we're going to try and answer the question, is your church covered what you need to know about insurance? Jared, thank you for joining Leadership Lessons.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me tell you about Jared. Jared Morgan is an insurance agent specializing in ministry-focused coverage for churches and nonprofits. A former youth minister, he's worked in the family insurance business since 2004 and serves as a deacon in his local church. Jared and his wife Joni have 4 children and remain active in youth missions and church ministry. So, Jared, let's hop right in here. Tell us about your role as an insurance agent and how churches and nonprofits are part of that.
Absolutely. So, Lightwell is a national brand, a national agency with local partners. We're the local partner for Kentucky, Tennessee, and Alabama. And we specialize in religious nonprofits. In fact, the Lightwell partners have made a lot of efforts to work together and coordinate our efforts across the nation. We are the largest church insurance agency that focuses exclusively on religious nonprofits. And that's really our bread and butter. And we wanted to, it's not just it's something we can do. It's something that we take pride in, that we deep dive in. We're concerned about the risk management, the tools that are out there beyond just the insurance piece of it. So risk management across the board.
You mentioned off camera that you kind of started that part of your family insurance business, that you had an interest in it. Your dad may not have had the same enthusiasm that you felt there. What made you want to kind of pursue that side of insurance business, Jared?
Well, so I had worked for a couple of years as a youth minister before moving home to work in the family business. My wife and I are from the same place, and when I moved back, I'd mentioned my dad. I said, "Hey, we should try to write churches." And he said, "I wouldn't do that. The competitors are so tough that you can't compete with them, and that you're going to be wasting your time and spinning your wheels." And I didn't listen to him, and had a few hard years starting out before we settled on our good partner in the business, Brotherhood Mutual. But once we did, we were able to really take off and compete and serve the church well in that capacity. But I guess I didn't listen, and it served okay in this case. There's been other times where it hasn't.
I think I heard you say you serve Kentucky, Alabama, and Tennessee. Is that correct? And
That's
then maybe
correct. Yeah.
A couple other places you branched out a little bit beyond that. What's unique about church and nonprofit insurance coverage and in your role of servicing those accounts that is just not the same as serving a regular business in town?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. There's more than a couple of things, but I would say really it's in many ways, it's an eternal service. So church leadership comes and go, but most of the time the churches do not. Now, there's times where churches are started and there's times where churches die, but by and large, we're dealing with the same set of customers, and our relationships with people turn over. You think about church leadership, there are places where churches stay a long time, or leaders in churches stay a long time, but there's also a lot of places where there's transition there. And we're always serving that institution through the different leadership that's there. Really, from a standpoint of exposure, churches have other people's children in their care, custody, and control. There are huge liabilities that come with that. Many of them are authorizing security teams to carry deadly force and respond to threats. Many of them are doing overseas missions. They may take online giving. All of those things have enhanced. And then there's always youth groups and youth ministers that are getting into crazy stuff that many times in retrospect probably have not been good risk management decisions, but that's part of the joy of ministry. So all of those things, and really, and I don't want to overlook, because this is really what's created challenges in our marketplace. But property insurance, churches have large buildings, and if they're using the square footage, and if the building is substantially damaged, they're going to need that square footage for ministry. So even though property insurance is basic 101 for most insurance companies, it can be a huge deal, especially in a time of heightened weather and loss. So that combination of property exposure and unique liability exposures. Another one I would throw on there would be a board of directors in some shape, form, or fashion that are making financial decisions, and there's exposure to liability for making a bad one in that space. So a lot of different areas.
This conversation is getting more and more depressing. So, Jared, I can't imagine being in your shoes. Every church building you walk into, you see everything that could be a problem. But other folks may not see that. So, what are some of the biggest insurance blind spots that churches may face?
So, hands down, the tremendous legal liabilities that have been brought to the forefront through both lawsuits and legislators in different states opening up the statute of limitations for child sexual abuse. You know, by and large, that is an area of insurance that is not unprofitable. And I don't mishear me when I say that. Churches have to have it, but the insurance companies that specialize in it would say we don't have a lot of claims in that space that turn into huge losses. However, it is a tremendously challenging environment when the litigation has come up and has really become easier to get class action and become more aggressive for mainline ministries that may seem like an attractive liability target for lawyers that are out there. When you have legislators that open up prior years where statutes of limitations are open, so don't hear me say that the victims in this are not deserving of service and their spiritual needs and emotional needs being met. But do hear me say that when there's a change in the environment where something that wasn't like that before becomes more attractive to lawsuits, it creates a real challenge. And I don't know that people realize both the preventative measures that need to go into properly overseeing other people's children's and doing it in the right way, and also how bad reputationally, even if it doesn't end up in a lawsuit, how bad reputationally it can challenge you if something comes up from that. So that I would say that's a blind spot that's becoming known. Man, another blind spot area that really has been driven by changes in the current environment is inflation. Insurance for a building, property insurance for a building is based on replacement costs. So that is, what would it cost us to hire a contractor to build the same square footage right now that you have? And so insurance is all about the principle of indemnity. We want to put you back where you are. So we want to put you back in the same type of building for the same square footage that you have. And the reality of that is, since 2019, the values of most construction have doubled. And so when you have that much of an increase in building limits, there's a trickle down effect before the consumer realizes, holy cow, we can't, number one, this is way more expensive than it used to be. Why has it gone up so much? Well, the building construction costs have gone up so much, and that's driven the insurance premium. And then if you sprinkle in some of the worst catastrophic weather years in history, you had this combination of, what my insurance limit should be last year is not the same limit as it should be this year. And I'll give a brief illustration of this. There's a big tornado that went through Mayfield and Marshall counties and many other counties in December of 2021. And in Marshall County, there's a neighborhood on the lake that got hit very hard. And these are homes, but I know of a couple that bought a house and had one insurance renewal. When they bought the house, they insured the house for replacement costs, and they had an extra 25% built into their policy so that they could go to 125% of what replacement cost should be. And then after one renewal, not multiple years, but after one renewal, their house got hit and destroyed in the tornado, and they were underinsured by like 30 or 40%. And that was just construction cost changes. So it wasn't that they were negligent in their overseeing of their insurance limits, that their insurance limit went up a little bit at that renewal, but it was just the cost of construction went up so fast that it's really difficult to keep up with, and you can't keep up with it without spending more money, which is a challenging environment.
Wow. So do some insurance 101. So think like a group of pastors maybe who are used to spending time in the Bible. They're not comfortable maybe with insurance contracts, or a group of just church leaders trying to think through their policy. What types of coverage should every church have in place, Jared?
Absolutely. Ideally, replacement cost on the building. So a limit that reflects the cost to build the building back. From a liability standpoint, at least $1 million of general liability coverage, at least $1 million of auto liability if they have a church vehicle, directors and officers liability, pastoral professional liability, sexual abuse coverage or sexual molestation coverage, depending on the carrier. Sexual acts coverage is another name for it. Cyber liability. It's a new one, but it's becoming a bigger and bigger deal. Let's see, what have I missed? Liability coverage for a security team if they have one. And then extension of that coverage for international missions on short-term trips or potentially longer term, depending on what they're doing.
So Jared, a couple of things that you said there, like on the cyber, I know, for instance, that we We became aware of a state convention that had a theft, a fraudulent theft of I want to think about $800,000 happened to
Mm-hmm.
them. We raised our cyber insurance to around 1.5 million for coverage, just given the amounts of money that we transfer on behalf of Kentucky Baptist to the partners that we serve. On the so all these things that are mentioned here, of those I think you mentioned 8 different ones. How many of those are required by law for a church to have those, and how many of those are just some things that a company like yours is thinking about where another insurer may not be thinking about? Talk about that just for a
Yes.
second.
So legal requirements, workers' compensation would be another one with employees. They're going
Okay.
to need workers' compensation. That's required in Kentucky for 1 part-time employee, Tennessee for 5,
Okay.
Alabama. So different states have different requirements there. And then sorry about that.
Oh, you're
So
good.
we have both work comp and auto are really the only legally required coverages by law.
Okay.
Churches can buy whatever they choose to purchase from there, but the real key on that is when working with either an agent or an insurance company, you want somebody that has a familiarity and a knowledge of ministry. And there are we've seen a lot of companies come into the space and get out of the space in my 20 plus years of insurance. And when that happens, a lot of the churches can be very attractive for insurance carriers because there's so much property exposure. But what you don't want to have happen is a carrier that doesn't have a lot of experience, for example, in something like a sexual acts liability claim, that's
Hmm.
handling it with people that don't really know or don't have the familiarity of how to handle it. And also that one, especially when you see a sexual abuse liability claim, many carriers want to start that conversation with signing contractual agreements that don't allow anybody to talk about it and hush it up and negotiate it. And really, what Brotherhood's approach and intent and our agency's approach and intent is what can we do to help this and offer spiritual counseling to the victims.
Hmm.
Finding out if there are victims and if it's a legitimate claim, let's try to start that discussion with counseling and care, and not start the discussion with a financial ransom or payoff, if you will, which is necessary at times. So I don't want to downplay that, but
Right.
really it's the spiritual care and spiritual concern that goes into it. And so when you work with a carrier, you want to work with somebody that's doing it because they're wanting to serve the church more so than they're just looking at it as a profit center for their insurance operations, if that helps. And then, do they have sample child protection policies? Do they help you in leadership team training for security? Do they know the moving parts for ministry continuation if the building's damaged, and how to make sure there's appropriate limits? Man, there's more than Dr. Gray, there's more than I could put into this conversation
Sure.
to represent the expertise that goes into it.
Yeah, I'm hearing that. So I think you may have answered this question. How do legal risk for churches differ from nonprofits? I've heard you talk about like these mission trips that churches are now going on regularly that needs to be make sure that's covered, or at least be able to get a rider or something to cover it. Security teams. I mean, these are in many cases armed folks in the church. That's
Yep.
obvious difference. Sexual abuse, maybe a difference. The directors and officers. What are other ways that legal risk for churches differ from other nonprofits? Jared.
Well, really, it's a spiritual intent. So other nonprofits may have a social end goal and social good that they're trying to serve in serving children or different groups, elderly, whatever it could be. We insure many non-religious nonprofits as well, but the difference in the intent with religious nonprofits is they're in it to serve God,
Hmm.
and the moral right and wrong discussion of serving others in the way that they serve others and how they operate is an assumption that should lead to better moral outcomes when they're making decisions. And there's times where people make bad decisions and make sinful decisions that are in church leadership, and that leads to consequences at the ministry. But really and truly, it's a different approach when you come in and you're saying, hey, our goal is to serve God in our community. Then your insurance company and your insurance agency that you're partnered with are there to help you fulfill that mission in impacting your local community. And insurance absolutely and risk management play a huge role in that.
Yeah. So as an example, the situation you referenced, that God forbid, a sexual abuse situation happens, the first response, if your heart is to serve churches, your first response isn't, let's see how little we can pay to get this settled. The first response is, let's deal with the victim and help them
Absolutely.
be made whole, and then work through the other side of it. Jared, can you share a real life example of a church that learned a hard insurance lesson? You don't need to share any details of a name or anything, but anything that would be helpful for the rest of us.
So there's a few. Obviously, we've got some great ones, and
Yep.
really I wanted to share what first always comes to mind in this is when I started my career. I had a minister who was going to do an overseas stint of several months in China, and maybe in Southeast Asia, and
Mhm.
I'll be general enough to say that it included China and a few other countries, but the church who was sponsoring this individual was looking at purchasing a travel policy, an accident policy for the minister while he's on this trip, and they really did not. They chose to go with a very inexpensive option that did not allow for a lot of coverage. And lo and behold, the individual went to an elephant reserve and ended up trying to pet an elephant, and ended up getting seriously injured by the elephants. And they ran out of money before they could even fly him home. And it was
Wow.
such a huge impact to me because I had gotten them to the cusp of purchasing an appropriate limit, and they chose not to because of the cost. And then I was getting fundraising emails from them saying, "Hey, we've had a guy that's really hurt. We're trying to raise enough money to get him home." And it was like, man, if that's not just the perfect illustration of doing things right on the front end for risk management to take care of things, and then I don't know what else is. But we've seen large losses. I know in Alabama, I think in maybe 2014, maybe a little bit before that, there were a huge series of storms that went through, and a lot of churches discovered they didn't have very good building limits, to the point where I believe that there were some industry publications that came out and said, "Hey, you need to be looking at your church insurance building limit, because in this situation," I think the numbers I remember were, and they weren't our customers, but the numbers I remember were something like 70% of those that had large losses didn't have enough building insurance to put back what they had. And so there's a time when a church has got more building than they need that you may not want to insure full replacement.
Mhm.
But normally when there's a large property loss, that's not the discussion of where did we cut on insurance to save some premium dollars. It's, we need every bit of this building, and we wish we had it all to where we could put it back.
I'm sure you've seen it all. What questions should pastors be asking when reviewing their insurance policy? I mean, that probably happens either every year or every 3 to 5 years, depending on their setting.
Yeah, so I have to talk a little bit about the current market conditions that we're in
Okay.
with the huge property limit increases. Those have driven a lot of premium increases. Some of the insurance companies have tried to go slow and steady on those building limit increases because they don't want to raise the price of their insurance so high that their customers choose to go elsewhere. That really is something that has to be communicated. Even if your insurance company has raised your limits on your building, they still may not be keeping up with inflation. So having a local contractor talk to your church leadership, figure out what they think it would cost to rebuild the building, and then having that feedback come back to your church insurance limits and looking at your property limits. That's probably one of the most urgent things right now, because at the same time, we've had, starting in 2019 to 2020, we've had year after year after year after year of the worst property losses due to weather that we've ever seen. And so every church insurance company in the business has had financial downgrades or strain from AM Best. Everyone that specializes in churches, the property damage and the limits damage has been so widespread that nobody that writes a lot of churches has made money. They've all lost money in that time period. So it really, the industry said, well, maybe the weather's getting better, and it's gotten to the point financially where the churches are not only trying to increase, the church carriers are not only increasing their limits on the building to keep up with inflation, but they're also now taking rate. Now they're pushing higher deductibles. And also on that property discussion is we're seeing percentage wind hail deductibles come in to play in all of the inland U.S. states, whereas in the past they would only be in your Texas and Louisiana and Florida and southern Alabama, and maybe coastal areas where hurricanes were more prevalent. So those have come to the middle of the U.S., and they're starting to come here for homeowners insurance too. Two of the biggest carriers in Kentucky have now both implemented 1% wind hail deductibles on homeowners policies. So The purchaser, the church leadership has not realized what that means. So the thing is, the industry said, "Hey, everybody's doing it, so we're going to slap the 1% when held deductible on there." And 1% is calculated as the building plus contents times 1%. So if you've got $1 million building and you add contents into there, you could have a $12,000 to $15,000 deductible, depending on your contents limit, really quickly. If you've got a $10 million building, which again, at the same time, property limits have gone up so high, you could have a $100,000 wind hail deductible. And ministries may not realize that either if their agent has not communicated it. Now there are buy down options that you can choose. Not all agencies that are selling church insurance are even aware those are out there. So it really has been a time of tremendous change and traumatic change to the premiums going up. At the same time, you've had the coverages be reduced because of the financial strain on the industry. So right now, more than ever, just property insurance is at an area where you need to be paying attention to it. That doesn't even touch on abuse and security team liability and cyber liability and directors and officers liability and pastoral professionals. So there's carriers that can handle that property, but they may not be able to touch the rest of the exposure and with appropriate coverage.
So, Jared, it's very possible that some folks who haven't looked at their policy closely the last 3 or 4 years, they're just drastically underinsured given the inflation and replacement costs that you're describing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what's going to get their attention is the premiums going up, and that should, in their position, is to making wise financial decisions for their ministry. But there's more to that discussion than just the premiums. There's also the coverage side of the equation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I've heard there are churches in some states that they cannot even buy insurance, period. They cannot buy property and casualty insurance.
Yep.
Is that true to your experience?
So what's happened in church insurance with property insurance has happened with every widespread property carrier. So it's homes, it's large buildings, it's apartments. So all of these heavy property exposed accounts have gotten hammered by the weather at the same time that the inflation's gone up. So you've had the cost of claims is higher than they were expecting, and the weather and the frequency of claims is way higher than expected due to the loss, due to the weather. So yes, so the reinsurance carriers have gotten hammered. They've taken rate, which means the insurance companies have had to take rate, which means the deductibles are going up. So it's been very widespread. So there's never been a worse time for a church that's had large losses to have to go try to find standard market or preferred carrier coverage. Earlier in my career, we might not even pulled loss runs before going to write an account that looked good. In this day in this environment right now, we are in a place where we have to have a history of losses before we even talk to an account to see if they could fit. And if they have a lot of losses, they're not going to get written by a preferred carrier. They're going to have to go to what we call the excess and surplus lines market. And the pricing can be 5 to 7 times more in the excess and surplus lines market than what the preferred market is.
Wow.
So never before, I would emphasize this more than anything else. Talk to your agent before turning in a claim. And if it's a small property claim, and I would say small being anything under 10,000, if it's a larger ministry, anything under 20,000, there's never been a better time for a ministry to take care of that kind of exposure out of budget than it is to hand it to the insurance. Because if there's 2 or 3 more of those claims, or if there's a large loss coupled with that could lead to a non-renewal, and the premium can go through the roof.
And we've seen several non-renewals. We've talked to you about some of those in the state.
Mm-hmm.
So, Jared, of all these things that we're talking about, if you're visiting with a church group that's in charge of overseeing the policy, and they say, what are some things that we could just do to make our church more insurable? What are 2 or 3 things that come to mind quickly?
And right out of the gate, higher deductibles on property. 100% higher deductibles on property. So look, we've lived in a world where $1,000 deductible was kind of like a standard. And if you look at what inflation, how much that has been eroded in purchasing power for $1,000, we now live in a world where there's shock when a deductible is pushed from, say, $2,500 up to $10,000. But when you do the math on that $10,000 and what it buys, it's not far off of what $2,500 bought in 2018. So you've had, higher deductibles, 100%. For ministries that have large youth ministry or child activities, putting in place a child protection policy, and that would include proper supervision, background checks on anybody working with kids, and a waiting period before new members are put in with children, and then have that written down, have it properly staffed, have it put in place to where it's actually being used accurately. And it is more than just something a minister that's happened to come along that knows how to do that. It's put in place. And if they leave, it falls apart. Having those procedures in place properly is a fantastic way of going about it. And it will make them better insurance risk. But I'll say this without hesitation. A church that's got a lot of property claims and a great child protection in place, the property claims right now in this environment are going to overshadow that to the point where they may lose insurance because of the property claims. And whereas even though they've got a good child protection policy in place.
Okay, so the call comes to us, and we reach out to you and several others. Talk to that church that has received that non-renewable notice that their carrier's just not going to do business with them for the upcoming period. What are their options? What can they do immediately?
So there may be some carriers, depending on their loss history, that a standard line carrier may dip their toes back in and say, yeah, they've had some losses, but we feel like we're going to be able to still cover them and may be willing to do that. If they do, their pricing's probably going up 30 to 50%, right? Mm-hmm. If the standard carriers say absolutely not, then their pricing's probably going up, like I said earlier, at probably 4 to 7% more than where they were. 400 is a substantial increase. So if you're paying $10,000 and you got to go to the E&S carriers, number one, the coverage is not going to be anywhere near what it would be with a preferred market. So your abuse may or may not be available. Your directors and officers should be, but the security team coverage, you may be getting just pure general liability coverage. And you're going to pay, if you're paying $10,000, you may be paying $50,000 versus the 10. But it's even more important that you work with an agency that knows how to place it and knows where those excess and surplus lines carriers are that can offer those additional liability coverages. Because a lot of what we see, the premiums go up, and a lot of agents may get interested in those accounts that wouldn't be otherwise because the premium is now a lot higher. But they're not putting them where they need to be put, especially on the liability side. They're ending up in a pure GL carrier place where they've just got standard liability insurance, but they don't have any of the bells and whistles. When somebody that does a lot of volume like we do, we know where we can try to get that coverage for the liability side. So I would absolutely say it may be even more important, even though the price, and it sounds terrible, they're paying 5 times more than what they were paying. But the pricing is even less important in that environment than getting the right coverage is. And there are limits to everybody's budget. Don't get me wrong, but jumping over for an inexpensive GL carrier with some property coverage when you could get the rest of those liability coverages like abuse and D&O and pastoral professional, we'd much rather put you in a place where you can get those. And it is available, but you got to have an agent that knows what they're doing.
Sounds like every church should be talking to an insurance professional who understands churches uniquely and the unique challenges that churches face, and want to help churches have the coverage they need for security teams and their mission trips and their youth gatherings and the like. Jared, last question. This platform is called Leadership Lessons. What is one leadership lesson that you had to learn the hard way?
Ooh, boy, that's a tough one. But I will say, as an employer, when hiring, if you've got a mistake or somebody on the team that's not a good fit, don't let them stay. You need to. It's better for you and the other person to move on as quick as you can and get it dealt with properly.
So I'm assuming that comes from experience. You don't have to call any names.
Yeah, absolutely. It is, and yep.
I think it's one of the hardest lessons for leaders to learn because on hiring, you just like someone, and if you like them, you may not do your due diligence to talk to the people and say, here's what I'm thinking. What are you seeing? And if you do, they might be like, you got to be kidding me. There's no way you can hire that person. Here's what happened to them the last 3 places where they work. So yeah, the rule of thumb is hire slow, fire fast. We work with a guy named Justin Irving who teaches at Southern Seminary. He's more, I think, Christian on that language, where he'll say hire intentionally and fire the same way. Walk with a person, try to help them improve. If they just can't possibly improve, you obviously have to let them go. Jared, anything else you need to mention before we hop off?
No, I'll say this. We are certainly not the only agency out there that specializes in churches. There's some really good ones out there, but there are a lot more that are dipping their toe in the market. And we'd rather you see most of the churches go to carrier or to agents and carriers that know the industry well. So if that's us, great. If it's one of our competitors, that's great too. But we'd rather see that professional expertise versus versus those that are just kind of playing there and don't know it well.
Jared, thank you for joining Leadership Lessons. It's great to talk to you. The conversation was very, very informative. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to Leadership Lessons. An audio podcast of this program is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. The Kentucky Baptist Convention was created by churches for churches to help churches reach Kentucky and the world for Christ. For more information about the KBC and the cooperative program which fuels our ministry, go to kybaptist.org. We'll see